proper skills. As it always happens, the catastrophe began completely unnoticed and long before the crisis. An old bulk carrier, once serving the mining settlements of the asteroid belt, had broken away from the quarantine station. The shoddy welding work and neglect of regular inspections had caused one of the fastening arms connecting the bulk carrier to the station to snap. The ship lost alignment. The oscillations began to accelerate relative to the station's center of gravity, and eventually, the remaining 5 arms burst one after another like drugstore rubber bands trying to hold a heavy dumbbell swinging on them. The central processor at the quarantine station dutifully sent a report of the accident to the service center, but the station was 16 light minutes from the center, and by the time they got the report, the bulk carrier was already gone. No one had expected that any of the old ships docked at the quarantine station's asteroid could suddenly run away, and the station's automation couldn't calculate the fugitive's course. The technicians of the center sent several probes to search for the bulk carrier, but there was almost no chance of finding the old vessel. The probes were to reach the scene only in 2 weeks, when the volume of space to be searched through would exceed all the capabilities of the search team. So the technicians gave a warning about the lost ship to the Navigation Committee of the Solar System, got their legal reprimand from their superiors, and forgot about the incident. On the scale of the system, the bulk carrier was a speck of dust, and the quarantine station was located in the middle of nowhere, far from any regular routes. The chances that the runaway ship would end up in a busy traffic zone were negligibly small. Then came the war with the Ullerians, and everybody forgot about an old decommissioned freighter lost somewhere in space. But the bulk carrier survived. It didn't fall into the sun or any of the giant planets. It didn't fly away into the void, but by some unique coincidence, it entered a comet orbit and became one of the numerous bodies of the solar system. With one correction, nobody knew about it. Its orbit, velocity, and mass were not calculated and entered into the Navigational Committee's logs. Still, the chances of its trajectory dangerously intersecting with something before the inner planet's observation systems could detect it were vanishingly small. But still, not zero. "Captain, sir, you must see this." Philip de Loyne put aside the book he was reading and looked at the man who had entered the bridge. For passenger mate Ahan now, it was his first voyage aboard Zealand, but he had been flying as a passenger mate on Solar United ships for several years now. He would hardly bother the captain of a large liner over nothing. "I'm listening," Philip said, looking at his subordinate expectantly. Ahan handed him the service tablet. "Perhaps I'm worrying for nothing, sir, but I thought you should know. This is the passenger list. Note the number 146. Philip took the tablet, scrutinizing the lines of small print. The usual list. Names, brief passenger details. What could be so unexpected that an officer should suddenly burst onto the bridge with a worried look? A popular music or movie star traveling in disguise? A controversial politician? A religious figure? Unlikely. Celebrities are frequent guests aboard system liners, and Ahan had probably encountered such people before. What else could there be? The military and police stopped using liners long ago, and even if they were to transport a dangerous criminal on a passenger ship, they are legally obliged to notify the owner company and, of course, the ship's captain. Okay, number 146. What do we have here? Zuman Adbochast. God, what a name. Philip had seen passengers of many different nationalities in his career, but this was the first time he had ever seen such an exotic name. Let's check where this Bokhast was from. The passenger number 146 was listed in the column Nationality as ULL. Philip scratched the bridge of his nose. What the hell was that? It was the first time he had ever come across such an abbreviation. Some new political entity of the outer colonies? But if it had been recognized as a subject of international law, it would have been in the news bulletin, and Philip wouldn't have missed it. ULL. He looked questioningly at Akan, again marveling at the extremely worried expression on his mate's face, and then it hit him. "Oh shit," said Philip, setting the clipboard aside. "We have a Ullerian on board?" "Yes, sir," Ahan nodded. "So far, he's staying in his quarters and keeping to himself. But if he decides to take a walk—" "You understand, sir, there could be trouble. I'm concerned for the safety of the passengers." There was no need for extra explanations. The 4-year war with the Ullerians had left a permanent scar on the public consciousness. Even though the population of the inner planets in the solar system had remained almost unaffected by the conflict, the outer colonies and the fleet had taken the brunt of it. The propaganda efforts had not been in vain. Tales of the ruthlessness and cruelty of the Ullerians raised the degree of hatred towards the enemy almost to the point of instant boiling. It had been 6 years since the end of the war, which had ended in a catastrophic defeat for the Ullerians, and passions had subsided somewhat, but if people saw a real Ullerian in front of them— Philip sighed. He wasn't sure how he would behave if he saw a recent enemy. He had served in the 2nd Strike Fleet during the war and participated in liberating several colonies captured by the Ullerians. He knew that the propaganda did not exaggerate the facts. On the contrary, sometimes it softened them. "How did he even get aboard unnoticed?" he asked, immediately realizing the question's absurdity. The automatic control system checked the passenger's identity against the documents presented, not his social status or citizenship. Officially, the Earth Confederation and the Ullerian Conglomerate were on relatively peaceful terms, and there was no reason to restrict the movement of citizens within each other's territories. Ullerians were generally humanoid, so loose hooded clothing was enough to disguise them on the way to their quarters. The Ullerian was probably taken through customs and border control at the passenger terminal by security, away from the public's eyes. Damn, they could have warned him. Philip felt a wave of irritation, but quickly suppressed it. What was the point of wasting his nerves on this now? He'd have his say when he got back, both to Solar United and to Venus Delta Terminal Security. "What do we do, sir?" Ahan's voice snapped the captain out of his gloomy musings. We'll increase surveillance on the quarters of that— what's his name? Bokost, in case he ever thinks of taking a walk. We can set up additional micro cameras in the corridor, sir. If he goes out, we'll know right away. The system tracks whenever a cabin door is opened, but it's counting the room service too, so it's not really effective. Just stay out of the cabin. We don't want a diplomatic scandal if he detects the surveillance. Philip got another idea. And here's another thing. Every Ullerian traveling through Confederate territory must have an official escort. This escort was unlikely to be marked as such on the passenger list, but he is probably stationed in a neighboring cabin. He picked up the tablet again. Let's see. One cabin is empty. By the way, this Ullerian has no shortage of funds. Those are double suites. Aha, here, Andre Mustaine from the— He looked closely and raised his eyebrows in surprise. New Hope? New Hope was one of the planets that had been occupied by the Ullerians the longest. Nearly half the population had died there. I didn't expect to see somebody from that planet as an escort. Anyway, please invite this Andre here. I need to talk to him. But keep it quiet. I think he'll understand. Yes, sir. The officer nodded and went out. 6 days remain until Zealand arrives at the Neptune transfer terminal. He wanted to believe that the damned Ullerian would sit still in his quarters during that time and not cause a riot by showing up at the restaurant in the middle of the evening show. What the hell was he doing here? And why hadn't anybody bothered to warn the ship's captain that he had a social time bomb on board? Philip didn't yet know that none of this would matter very soon. By another coincidence, a software glitch occurred in the processing unit of the long-range scanner of the Zealand a few days ago. This glitch caused an avalanche of errors, which eventually led to the fact that the scanning data of the entire sector ceased to be received by the navigation processor and the central control terminal on the bridge of Zealand. Instead, the same 2-day-old summary began circling around the circuits, showing space clear even of micro-meteorites. So the scanner sensors that had spotted the old bulk carrier on a collision course with the system liner were sending their information nowhere. It fell into the data processing unit, looped by the glitch, and died quietly there. The sensors had done their job. These primitive devices, of course, didn't care what would happen with their data after they transferred it. There was not much time left before the collision of two ships. Andre Mustaine turned out to be a woman. Philip had not expected this. When Andre entered the briefing room, where meetings with customs and other officials of ports and stations were usually held, he was somewhat confused. It seemed natural to Philip that the Ullerian's escort could only be a man, preferably a heavily armed commando. However, Philip immediately realized the absurdity of this assumption. It was impossible to bring weapons aboard the ship. No tricks would help. But still, a woman. Andre's handshake was pleasant, warm and confident, but without trying to prove anything. She was thin, rather tall by Earth standards, about 40 years old, with blonde, short-cropped hair and a hard look in her brown eyes. Judging by her age, Philip figured that she must have survived the Ullerian occupation as an adult, whether she had been part of the field resistance, the city underground, or had spent all that time in a concentration camp. He hesitated to ask, lest he inadvertently say something tactless. Most of the survivors of the occupation did not like to talk about those years. "To be honest, I expected you to contact me sooner," Andre said. Philip didn't let the fleeting annoyance show on his face. "I would have done so," he said, "if I'd had the slightest idea that there was a Ullerian among the passengers." Andre squinted at him. "If you had known that we had bought tickets for your flight, you would surely have found an excuse to keep us off the ship. I assure you, the Ullerian poses no danger to the other passengers and crew." "I wish I shared your confidence," Philip said dryly. "But given the circumstances and, let's just say, some personal experience, I can't." Andre sighed. "You've been in the war, haven't you?" "Yes," Philip answered briefly without going into further detail. "Second strike, right?" Andre pointed to the small badge on Philip's tunic. Normally, members of passenger ship crews were not supposed to wear military insignia and decorations, but there were some exemptions for higher officers. Philip appreciated her experience. Not every colonist knew much about naval insignia. "I saw you on East 4th during the Liberation Parade. We moved there from New Hope as soon as the quarantine was lifted. It was too hard to stay." Andre shook her head. "Captain DeLoyne, I'm officially stating that the Ullerian you have on board is no more dangerous than any other passengers." "And unofficially?" Andre shrugged. "Unofficially, Captain, you realize I didn't just end up accompanying Bocast for no reason, right?" Philip shook his head slightly. "Zuman belongs to the Order of the Discarnate. It's a new... No, you can't call it a religion. It's more of a philosophical movement, gaining popularity in the conglomerate. Its adherents are calling for a radical change in thinking, a rejection of the old way. Do you know what the old way is?" Philip nodded. "All for the benefit. A simple motto, the quintessence of the old way, the predominant philosophical and religious system of the Ullerians. It was to be taken Literally, everything that existed in the universe was to be used for the benefit of Ullerian civilization. Accordingly, anything that could not be used was to be destroyed. The humans were fortunate to have encountered the conglomerate at a time when they were outnumbering the Ullerians by hundreds of times. Ullerian history books describe at least 2 cases of total obliteration of useless civilizations. The journey Zuman is undertaking is a pilgrimage of sorts. He has already visited all the inner planets, and now he wants to visit each of the belt worlds and then the outer colonies, Andre said. It's as important to him as, say, the Hajj to Mecca is to Muslims, or visiting the Blue Moon is to Neophysites. But most importantly, he has had part of his median gland surgically removed. Zuman is simply physically incapable of violence. Philip stared dumbfounded at Andre. Memories about the Ullerian stormtroopers, whose reaction and strength were dozens of times superior to human ones, still sometimes gave him nightmares. The Ullerians owed much of that superiority, as well as their incredible cruelty and tendency to solve all problems with violence, to a complex hormone that remotely resembled a super-powerful version of adrenaline, which was produced by the median spinal gland. For any Ullerian to voluntarily agree to have it removed, impossible. "Suppose I believe you," he said finally. "But that's only part of the problem. The other, much bigger one, is the other passengers. If they find out that there's a Ullerian on board, I can't predict exactly what will happen, but it won't be good. You won't be able to explain anything to them about peace-loving religion and removed glands. You'll probably be torn to pieces along with the Ullerian before you can say a single word." Andre smiled as if she had heard some old, but still successful joke. "Then it's up to you and me to make sure no one finds out about this, isn't it, Captain?" She stood up. "As it seems that we have no other choice." When she left, Philip sat in prostration for a while. Ullerian on ship. He'd much rather have discovered a large shipment of drugs or some homegrown terrorists on board. However, Andre was right. They have no options. He would put cameras at the entrance to the cabin, of course, and he probably must relocate the passengers from this sector under some pretext so that it would be possible to shut down the whole sector if needed. Even Ullerian can't get through the emergency bulkhead. But damn it, it's amazing how calm this Andre woman is. Though for a moment, when she talked about moving from New Hope, Philip had thought something had flashed in her gaze, something black and creepy. But it was washed away by her pleasant smile. He didn't have time to finish the thought because a giant, invisible hand pulled him out of his chair and, like a rag doll, threw him against the wall lined with light-colored plastic. The growing snowball of coincidences and failures was rapidly rolling to a conclusion. The bulk carrier looming inexorably toward the Zealand remained invisible to her systems almost to the very end. A few minutes before the collision, it was finally detected by the auxiliary detection systems. But the processor went the wrong way. It studied the data, a considerable object weighing several 100,000 tons, which appeared as if by magic from nowhere, compared it with the results of observations for the last few days, where there was nothing close to it, and wrote it off as a random failure in the system. Only at the very last moment did the watch navigator pay attention to several strange messages about program failures, manually bypass the analytical blocks of the navigational processor, and put the data from the scanners on his screen. When the meaning of the numbers reached his consciousness, he was petrified with horror for a moment and, therefore, had no time to press the alarm button or call the captain. However, both of these actions would have made no difference. As a final gift of mercy, fate decided not to throw a 1 on all 5 dice simultaneously. The bulker hit Zealand tangentially, thanks to which both ships did not instantly turn into a single cloud of burning debris. The angular frame of the old ore carrier plowed diagonally through the elongated hull of the passenger liner, leaving a terrible but still not fatal wound, and rushed on, slightly changing the orbit, which, as a result, will someday lead the bulk carrier to fall into the sun. On the other hand, Zealand continued on almost the same course. Neither the navigational processor nor the engines had been damaged, so the automation made the necessary corrections almost immediately to prevent random rotation, and the slightly off course could be corrected later. Inside the liner, people were beginning to feel the shock. Philip came to his senses from the acrid odor that made his throat scratchy. His head was buzzing, and his eyes were watering desperately, but all his bones seemed intact, and he could think relatively coherently, though he still had no idea what had happened. Maybe the Ullerian was a saboteur and had tried to blow up the liner, he thought wildly. But it was a stupid idea. In theory, it was possible to sneak explosives on board, but certainly not in the quantity that would cause such consequences. The source of the odor was a bluish haze billowing from the ventilation grate. It wasn't smoke. There was no smell of burning. Most likely, some piping had burst somewhere, and something had started leaking into the ventilation system. Now, until the source of the leak was identified, he could only hope it wasn't too toxic. Philip jumped up and rushed to the bridge. Anything not anchored to the floor or walls now rested against the opposite wall from the bridge entrance. A few paces away, the watch navigator shook his head, standing on all fours, alive and seemingly unharmed. Good. Philip jumped to him, but the officer waved him off, and the captain rushed to the main control panel. The scale of the disaster became apparent just a few seconds later. Some object comparable in mass to the Zealand had literally demolished the upper deck and badly damaged the next two. The energy core and engines were intact, which was good. Philip thanked the conservatism of shipbuilders who, even years after the war, continued to place the captain's bridge in the heart of the vessel, even on civilian ships. However, it was a small consolation because the top 3 decks were reserved for the cheapest cabins and were traditionally the most densely populated. A cold sweat broke out on Philip's forehead and back at the realization of how many people had died there, but he forced himself to chase away the instant despair. There would be time for grieving later. Now it's time to rescue the survivors and help the wounded, who would probably number in the dozens, if not hundreds. Philip reached out to call the medical section on the intercom. He froze, staring in horror at the blinking red light. The recovered navigator typed a command on his terminal at that moment, and a holographic projection of the liner appeared above the control panel with a preliminary assessment of the damage. A massive laceration was crossing the Zealand askew, and the spot where the sick bay had once been located was in the middle of this monstrous rupture. During the last ship refurbishment, it had been decided to move the doctor's domain to the most populous part of the liner, the second deck. The next half hour demonstrated that the endless training and drills had not been in vain. Even the passengers, at first terrified and anxious, became imbued with the discipline and firmness of the liner's crew, and the rescue quickly took on a well-organized character, as much as was possible under the circumstances. Philip had no time or energy to express his pride in his subordinates, but he promised himself that he would do his utmost to see that they were all honored in the future. But that was for later. First things first. The situation was not hopeless. As far as it was possible to reconstruct from scraps of data, some ancient ore carrier built many years before the war had crashed into the Zealand. It doesn't matter now where it came from, but it was clear that it was a typical ghost ship, and that, having done his black work, it continued to nowhere. So Zealand was in no further danger. The primary energy core and engines were unharmed, and the ship retained control. But the casualties were nightmarish. According to preliminary estimates, about 300 people had been killed in the strike, and about 100 more were missing. Philip feared that most of them would also end up on the mournful list. The wounded were numerous, mostly with fractures, bruises, and contusions of internal organs, and not a single doctor could be found among the passengers. Unfortunately, if there were any on board, they were among those directly hit by the bulk carrier. Of course, the liner's personnel had taken first aid courses, and most of the crew could handle relatively straightforward tasks, such as treating simple fractures, minor concussions, and cuts. However, there were still at least 2.5 seriously injured, and the number grew as the rescue effort expanded to the most damaged parts of the ship. They were all being taken to one of the restaurants, hastily converted into a makeshift hospital. Philip had ordered that all the small first aid kits and all the medical supplies in possession of the passengers be collected and delivered there, leaving only vital drugs and supplies for the people. A volunteer pharmacist from the passengers sorted through this flood of headache pills, birth control medications, antihistamine aerosols, and antibacterial patches, but it was woefully inadequate. Worst of all, several of the wounded, clearly suffering from internal bleeding and other severe trauma, needed urgent surgery, or they might not live to see the following day. "Try to interview the passengers again, including the wounded," Philip said tiredly to the third mate, who was in charge of the hospital. "There may be someone familiar with medicine. I don't care if it will be a dentist or a hospice nurse. Anything would do. Otherwise, we'll either have to watch people die in our arms or become the surgeons ourselves, with instruments from the engine room." He knew there was little hope, but saw no other way out. Philip disconnected and allowed himself a moment's pause, although the intercom was flashing with many lights waiting for his response. It was a quirk of fate. He had been through the entire war and served on the long-range cruiser Poseidon, but had first encountered the consequences of direct hit only now, in peacetime. And it didn't matter that it wasn't a Ullerian torpedo, but a rogue ghost freighter. The rules were the same. Prevent panic, organize rescue efforts, and maintain discipline. There were other veterans among his subordinates and among the passengers too, for sure. That must have helped. If there had been chaos and disorder, things could have been much, much worse. His attention was drawn to some confusion at the bridge entrance. A sentry posted by regulation at the door was trying to block the way of someone who wanted in very badly. Of course, it was not a Marine, as on warships, but a cadet with a stunner, which he probably didn't know how to use. So a few moments later, Philip jumped up with his hand on his holster to meet the two who had entered the room. The Ullerian's narrow, long face did not flinch, even when several guns were pointed at him. He only raised his hands slowly, turning them with open palms toward Philip, a universal gesture demonstrating the absence of weapons and peaceful intentions. The movement made the ample sleeves slip down to his elbows, exposing forearms that seemed to be coiled from steel cables. Philip knew that a Ullerian could rip a grown man in half with his bare hands, and their skin was capable of deflecting many things, including medium-caliber bullets. Eugenics had been Ullerian state policy millennia before they developed genetic engineering, and they had wasted no time. "Please." Andre stepped forward. She had a large bruise on the left side of her face. Obviously, the disaster had taken her by surprise as well. Zuman and I want to help. There's no danger, I told you, Captain." Philip felt his finger tense on the trigger of his blaster. If the Ullerian will attack, he'd have time to put at least a couple of charges into the alien. Earth stunners worked on Ullerians, but with far less effectiveness. The question was what the woman would do in the meantime. The Ullerian blinked. Philip saw a stiff horn flap slide from Ullerian's brow, move downward momentarily, and then retract back up. This flap was even stronger than alien skin, and he could change the composition of the moisturizing fluid secreted by the glands hidden in the grooves to neutralize any poisons in the eyes. "We heard you needed doctors," the Ullerian said. "We can provide assistance." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, his narrow lips barely open as he spoke. "It is important." Philip didn't understand what the Ullerian's last line referred to. Was it important to the ship or Dumont himself? But he didn't care. "Are you a doctor?" Philip asked, still aiming his blaster at the Ullerian. The Ullerian shook his head. His race didn't actually have a direct gesture of denial, so he'd borrowed it from humans. And for humans, his own people simply wouldn't understand him. Interesting fact. "No, but I can do some surgery. I possess the proper skills." Philip saw a flicker of horror in the cadet's eyes. To the young man, the Ullerians were a nightmare from his childhood. Monsters on the news. Demons to be driven back to the hell from which they had escaped. But anyone who had been through the war and encountered Ullerians in person knew that for all their ability to inflict terror, Ullerians never lied. There was no such concept as lying in their civilization. True, no one believed them anyway, but there was no choice now. "You'll work in an isolated room, behind locked doors," Philip said, having made his decision. "If we suspect foul play from your side, we'll just pump out the air, and you mustn't be seen. If people discover that the surgeon is being replaced by a Ullerian, I can't guarantee your safety, or ours, to be honest." "I understand," Zuman said. "I'm ready. It's part of the new way." Philip thought quickly. The Ullerians were far superior to humans in reaction speed and precision of movement, including fine motor skills. That might compensate to some extent for their lack of experience, but the anatomy of the Ullerians, despite their outward resemblance to humans, was very different. They weren't even mammals, though they had a similar metabolism and could eat Terran food. Philip shuddered at the last thought, but forced himself to get back to the point. "Do you need any surgical manuals? Manuals of human anatomy?" "No," Zuman said. "I know anatomy. I don't need anything." "I'll assist him," Andre said. "I learned some of those skills too, on New Hope." Philip noted that her voice sounded even more impassive than the Ullerians. "I'm afraid we don't have the tools either," he said. "Everything was destroyed along with the sickbay. All we can quickly gather are utensils from the galley. We can get ultraviolet lamps and clean tablecloths for sheets. We can arrange for anesthesia. There are some suitable medication in the first aid kits." "That'll do," the Ullerian said without moving. Apparently, he had not yet mastered the gesture of assent, a nod. "Where to go?" "Wait here while we prepare the room," Philip answered. "Then my men will escort you out, so you won't be seen by anyone." He looked intently at Andre. "I hope you won't let us down." "It's the way of the Order of the Discarnate," said the woman. "We can't fail." Philip didn't understand what she meant. What did she have in common with some strange Ullerian philosophy? He was only able to observe the first two patients. When Zuman picked up the fish-cutting knife, all the knives were additionally sharpened, but they still looked like ordinary kitchen utensils, and bent over the first patient. Philip could barely restrain himself from storming into the former vegetable pantry that had been converted into a surgical unit and firing a full blaster clip at the Ullerian. However, the alien, working clearly and quickly, with Andrea's help, opened the patient's abdomen and sutured up the partially damaged spleen without damaging any other organs or major blood vessels, and the captain relaxed slightly. After the second surgery, on a patient with a complex tibia fracture, Philip returned to the bridge. 3 days later, the first rescue ships approached Zealand. By this time, the Ullerian had performed surgery on 16 people, all of whom had survived. He worked almost non-stop, only occasionally drinking water and once asking for food. Andre assisted him for nearly 24 hours straight, then passed out. She just collapsed, barely stepping out of the room, slept for 10 hours, then woke up, had a snack, and went to assist Zuman again. Philip knew that in the future, he would have to explain his decision to the commission investigating the crash's circumstances and the crew's actions, but that would be later. Unfortunately, a few people still died before they got a chance to get to the surgery, and every decision on who should be treated immediately and who could wait would stay with Philip forever. An hour before the rescuers docked at Zealand, the Ullerian and Andre had finished the last surgery, and they were escorted to their quarters just as discreetly as before. Philip personally shook hands with both the woman and even the Ullerian, managing not to show the deep-seated, almost instinctive terror and distrust to the alien. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "That was a well-done job. Without you, almost all of these people would probably be dead." "Part of the atonement," the Ullerian said. "It was necessary, especially for me." Philip hesitated. "Speaking of you, you said on the bridge that you had proper skills, even though you weren't a doctor, but you didn't specify what it was. May I ask what your specialty is? Biologist?" He knew that the Ullerians made no distinction between the study of sentient and non-sentient species. Birds and humans, for example. The horn flaps slid down and up. "No," said Zuman. "I was a cook, in the Blue Fleet commander's kitchen." He stepped back, and the door to his quarters closed before the meaning of those words reached Philip. "Oh my God," said the crewman accompanying them, one of the engineers and a war veteran, then bent in half and vomited directly onto the lush carpet. Philip looked at Andre in horror. "And you knew all this time? God, how could you? It was the Blue Fleet that was standing on New Hope. Why would you accompany this monster?" The woman met his gaze, and in her eyes, Philip saw an abyss of hell, a darkness like he had never seen before, not even in the darkest moments of war. "Everyone has his own way of redemption," she said in an even voice. "Why do you think I was so good at assisting Zuman? I possess proper skills as well. The Ullerians were very good at suppressing the will of slaves, and then assigning them jobs they didn't want to do themselves." She looked straight into Philip's eyes. "I was Zuman's main supplier," she said. "I worked at the meat factory." Shadow Raiders. Even though the dock's exhaust ventilation was fully operational, the acrid odor made his eyes water and his nostrils sting. Lehan leaned against the leering on the second level, watching the maintenance crew fussing over the raider on the far repair ramp. The smell was familiar to him, as it was to anyone who'd served in Space Fleet, except, perhaps, for the haughty admirals with confident, steady voices and steely, squinting eyes. The people who give orders and plan strategically important operations are rarely confronted with the immediate results of their decisions. Nothing smells like the metal of ship hulls melted from missile bursts or plasma blasts. The combination of monstrous temperatures and instantaneous cooling in the cosmic vacuum produced strange effects. The metal shredded, bursting like rubber in the cold, and it started to smell odd. It was amazing that this raider had made it to the mothership. Lehan counted at least 4 missile hits and 3 plasma blasts, one of which nearly vaporized the left engine. Compared to that, Lehan's Raider still got off easy. Just one hypervelocity missile from a Ullerian fighter hit Lehan just seconds before he blasted the enemy away. It happened at the very beginning of the battle with the Ullerian fleet, when no one knew it would end in a crushing defeat for the Federation. Lehan had lost 60% of his engine power and had been forced to return to the carrier. This pilot, on the other hand, fought almost to the very end. Almost. Those who fought to the end never came back. "It was Foyce," came a voice behind him. Lehan turned around. He was almost unfamiliar with Captain Odysson. The Raider pilot didn't have much reason to be intimately involved with the fleet's deputy chief of strategic operations. Sure, Lehan had seen the captain during fleet ceremonial gatherings and occasionally crossed paths at extended operational meetings, where he was present as a squad leader, but they had hardly exchanged a formal phrase or two in person during Lehan's entire time on the Iceland carrier. "At ease." Odysson preceded Lehan's attempted salute. "Did you know Foyce, Lieutenant?" Lehan took another look at the mangled Raider. "Not closely, sir," he said. "There's a lot of us out here. Pilots, I mean. Besides, people change often. You don't have time to make a lot of friends." They both knew the meaning behind the colorless euphemism. People change. The losses among Raider pilots were unprecedented. Besides, Lehan was absolutely sure that Odysson was fully aware of all his buddy and not-so-buddy connections with each of Iceland's 1,400-plus crew members. If the head of secret operations had decided to personally honor an ordinary Raider pilot with his attention, he must have read Lehan's file in detail and must have found something useful in it. Odysson was silent, looking Lehan straight in the eye, and the pilot suddenly realized that very soon his fate would probably radically change once and for all. "Well, the psychologists say you have a good chance of becoming good friends," said the officer, "if only because you'll have no other choice." Memory is a strange thing. Sometimes, yesterday's events are lost somewhere in its depths, and sometimes it keeps in every detail what happened to you many years ago. Such was the case with Lehan's first conversation with Captain Odysson. The years since that moment had blended into a single indistinct whole with occasional bright spots. But the day that had been the prologue to the new life of Lehan and his 3 companions, though they had hardly known each other that day, had emerged from memory at the first request as if it had just been experienced. 14 years. Hard to believe. Lehan stepped out of the shower and wiped himself dry with a somewhat balding towel. His muscles ached pleasantly after 2 hours in the gym. He'd have to try again to get Achebe to resume. A pilot still had to keep himself in decent shape. Otherwise, an accident like Kestel's could happen. They had lost Kestel first, some 7 years after they had been dropped off at Shadow Base. The personnel for the base were supposed to be selected by experienced psychologists, taking into account the specifics of the upcoming mission. Lehan remembered well the endless tests and interviews he had been put through for 3 weeks after giving his consent to Captain Odysson. He had no doubt that the other 3 Shadow Base pilot candidates had been put through the same brain grinder. In fact, he suspected there were far more candidates. There was probably more than one Shadow Base, but of course no one had ever said a word to him about it. What you don't know, you can't tell. The Ullerian interrogation methods would crack open anybody. Apparently, even Odysson's sophisticated psychological selection and training machine sometimes malfunctioned. By the end of the 5th year, it was clear that something was wrong with Kestel. He became increasingly sullen and withdrawn, reduced his contacts with the other 3 pilots to exchanging a few words when receiving and handing over the watch at the communications console, and was entirely out of mode. Previously neat and tidy, he's grown a scruffy beard, and his crumpled uniform hung on him like old rags on a garden scarecrow. He kept up his watch, however, neither missing nor being late. Lehan desperately hoped that the special receiver for the coded hyperlink, which had been silent for the second year, would come to life, and they would get the mission. A combat mission was sure to cheer everyone up, Kestel above all. However, communication with the center was cut off. Their last mission had been to attack a Ullerian convoy of 3 container ships escorted by 2 corvettes and a frigate. The warships, of course, were Ullerian, but the container ships were Earth-built and almost certainly had human crews, enslaved or voluntary collaborators. That didn't bother the pilots of the Shadow Base. You will remain deep in the rear of the Ullerian Conglomerate occupied zone, Audison had told them in one of their first training sessions. Almost at the old border of the Federation. I think it's no secret to you that the Ullerians are actively using Federation citizens for their own purposes, including in the crews of their cargo fleet. Your primary objective will be to destabilize the Ullerian supply lines. Do you understand what that means? They did. They were to destroy any ship, no matter who was in command. There could be no friendly ships deep behind Ullerian lines. Of course, it was a shame that humans would die in these attacks, especially those who had been reprogrammed by the Ullerians to be slaves. But it can't be helped. War is war. And that's where conscious collaborators go. The planetoid where the Shadow Base is located is in an anomalous zone. Hyperspace scanners don't work there, and hyperspace communication is only possible using special narrowly focused signals. The chances of the Ullerians detecting you there are very slim. You won't be able to contact the center. The outgoing signal will be much easier to pick up. May I ask you a question, sir? Achebe raised his hand. Yes. How long is this mission supposed to last? When do we return? Otison looked at the 4 young pilots before him, and Lehan saw the absolute zero of open space in his gaze. When the order is given, he said, waiting for the next logical question. But none of them ever asked one. Everything was clear enough as it was. One of the mandatory exercises for Shadow Base pilots was simulator training in a centrifuge capsule. Sure, it was a little like the overload of combat sorties, but anything was better than nothing. Kestel, who was sinking deeper and deeper into depression and alienation from which no medication could save, though Lehan suspected that at some point Kestel had stopped taking it, had abandoned these exercises along with the regular gym. Lehan was getting more and more worried, and was about to talk to Achebe and Foyce about how to get Kestel back to a more or less normal state when the accident happened. They didn't have a particular schedule for centrifuge training. After all, with a regimen of 2 hours once a week, 4 people could agree quite well without too much bureaucracy. If someone came to the centrifuge and it was occupied, they simply waited until the machine was free. What did an extra couple of hours mean to someone whose whole life, year after year, consisted of waiting? Lehan was sitting in the wardroom solving another chess problem when Achebe and Foyce entered. Kestel's dead, Foyce said. He'd always tended to be short and direct, and a few years on Shadow Base had sharpened that trait to a razor-sharp edge. We just pulled his body out of the centrifuge. Lehan jumped up, knocking over a board, and rushed toward the exit. I came in this morning, but the simulator was occupied. I figured it was one of you. Foyce nodded at Lehan and Achebe. Kestel hadn't been there in a while. Came back 2 hours later and met Achebe there, who said he'd just seen you in the wardroom. That's when we discovered the control panel was locked. They'd just completed a ritual that could roughly be called Kestel's funeral. They didn't have a coffin, and they couldn't send the body into outer space, as was the Navy's custom. The planetoid's gravity didn't allow it, and Shadow Base had no escape pods. So they simply laid the dead Kestel down in one of the emptied storage rooms and depressurized the compartment. Now they had their own service crypt. Kestel had spent almost 8 hours in the centrifuge. He arrived at the simulator a little after midnight. He'd disabled the vitals tracking system so they couldn't pinpoint exactly when he died, but from the looks of it, Kestel's dead body had been spinning in the centrifuge for at least 3 hours by the time they found him. Leyhan downloaded a recording from the simulator, and they partially reviewed some of the scenarios Kestel had gone through. They all boiled down to the same thing. A lone raider would throw itself into a suicidal attack against a combined Ullerian battle fleet. Occasionally, it managed to burn out a few interceptors or even fire torpedoes at capital ships, but it invariably ended with the same predictable result. Leyhan stopped the recording then, and they went to their quarters in silence, not looking at each other. The Shadow Base's stockpiles would be enough for a full garrison for 100 years. Captain Ottoson had explained to them that the base had been built and equipped as a regular outpost, but the war had moved the front lines too quickly, and it had been decided to keep the base classified and to station only 2 raiders there. As soon as the course of the war can be turned and the opportunity arises, we'll evacuate you, Ottoson said. But until then, you'll have to rely on yourselves. Communication will be one way, only narrowly coded packets with new assignments. They were silent again. There was nothing to talk about. Everyone was well aware that Ottoson's optimistic "as soon as" was, in reality, meant to sound like "if," and with a very large tinge of "never." On several occasions, more to kill time than out of practical necessity, Leyhan had taken inventory of the Shadow Base warehouses. The usually stodgy fleet intendants had apparently clashed with the steely will of Captain Ottoson or one of his colleagues. The pilots had feared at first that they were in for a Spartan existence on a limited selection of nutritious but utterly tasteless army rations, but the warehouses were stocked with ordinary food. Of course, in frozen or freeze-dried form. It occurred to Leyhan more than once that if it weren't for this seemingly down-to-earth domestic circumstance, perhaps they'd all gone down the same path as Kestel much sooner. Achebe had a remarkable culinary talent. From time to time, he spent days in the kitchen, organizing gastronomic feasts for his companions. Then Foyce found a moonshine still in the kitchen pantry, and Achebe's lonely vigils in the galley had to be stopped. Leyhan and Foyce kept closely watching Achebe for some time, but he did not revert to the habit. Strangely enough, he took the loss relatively easily, though Leyhan feared a severe breakdown. A couple of years later, Achebe himself admitted that he realized that he had stepped onto the road to the abyss, but that he lacked the will to turn away, and that he suspected that he had subconsciously chosen such an idiotic place to hide the still in the hope that someone would find it and make a decision for him. The hyperlink receiver remained silent. Occasionally, some scraps of messages seemed to break through the white noise of static, but they were too garbled to be understood or reconstructed. Even so, it only matters a little. Anything that didn't come through the special channel wasn't worth considering. Ottoson had warned them that at some point, the Ullerians would surely guess the existence of the Shadow Base and try to lure it to the surface, force it to reveal itself so they could pick up its coordinates and destroy it. They are far from stupid. On the contrary, they will most likely try to use their slaves as bait at some point. Remember, you will be deep behind enemy lines. No friendly ships will be there. If anyone happens to reveal your location, you will be obligated to destroy them. That's how they lost Foyce. The alarm went off during Achebe's watch in their 8th year on Shadow Base. It had been more than 3 years since their last mission, so Leyhan caught himself running to the central console with a thrill of anticipation. like a boy to a Christmas tree with presents underneath. Small-size class vessel, Achebe reported. A frigate of some sort. It's not Ullerian in shape, but it's still unfamiliar. Probably built on one of the occupied colonies. Take a look. He displayed several images from various scanners and security cameras on the view screen, carefully disguised as asteroids and other objects in the system where the shadow base was located. The ship was indeed small, about 3 times the size of a raider. No gun turrets or missile launchers were visible on it, but Lehan knew that didn't mean anything. They could have been concealed under sliding armor plates. "Looks like it hasn't spotted us yet," Lehan said, looking at the unfamiliar ship drifting slowly along the asteroid belt. "Probably a random scout. If they knew Shadow Base was here, they'd probably send something bigger than a single frigate." "We have orders," Foyce said. "We have orders not to reveal the base's location under any circumstances," Lehan replied. "What if this is a decoy? What if that frigate is hanging out in the open channel with a strike group, just waiting to drop on our heads on its bearing? We can't take that risk." "We have orders," Foyce repeated. Lehan drew in air through clenched teeth irritably. "I have orders," he said. "I am in command of the base, and I will not reveal its location unless absolutely necessary." "Look." Achebe zoomed in on one of the images from the long-range surveillance cameras. The quality was mediocre, as the camera optics had become cloudy and micro-damaged over time. Still, at one point, it managed to capture a relatively clear picture of the side of an unfamiliar frigate. Achebe typed a couple of commands to try to clear the image of interference. "What is it?" Achebe's question hung in the air. 2 inscriptions were clearly visible on the frigate side, one above the other. The upper line was a standard set of letters and numbers of the registration number and the name of the ship, Warrior of the Way. And the bottom one. Lehan couldn't read Ullerian, but he wouldn't have mistaken the spiky, dancing patterns of the Ullerian alphabet for anything else. "This ship is new," Achebe said. "Not just because it's an unknown model. It looks like it came off the slipway recently. Even the paint is shiny, not a scratch. So they were able to rebuild the orbital shipyards," Lehan said, "most likely on New Hope, and made the engineers work for them. Damn slavers. Warrior of the Way is a typical Ullerian name." Achebe looked around. "Where's Foyce?" he asked. They had almost caught up with him. Almost. They were just reaching the closed hangar doors when the floor shuddered, and a low thud sounded through the thick metal. One of the raiders had launched. The crew of the Shadow Base raiders consisted of 2 people, a pilot and a gunner. Of course, the raider could be launched into space by one pilot, and the weapons control could be switched to the pilot. The problem was that Foyce stole the raider in Hangar 2. It was the same one that Lehan had started scheduled maintenance on 3 days ago, and from which he had already removed all the ammunition, energy cells for the plasma guns, homing missiles, and 2 large antimatter torpedoes designed to hit capital ships. Lehan looked at Achebe. Achebe nodded back, and they rushed to the first hangar, where the raider stood fully equipped for departure. Of course, they had no chance of catching up with Foyce. The raiders were identical, except that the mass of the one stolen by Foyce was smaller by the substantial margin of missing munitions. In addition, both Lehan and Achebe, who now occupied the cockpit, were noticeably inferior to Foyce in their skill at flying the raider. Foyce was a true ace. Achebe tried to catch up with him while at the same time unsuccessfully calling on the battle channel. Meanwhile, Lehan could not catch the rapidly zigzagging raider in the grasp of the missile guidance system. Couldn't or wouldn't. The Ullerian frigate didn't notice anything until the very last moment, just moments before the inevitable, It seemed to realize something, and the ship suddenly began to pick up speed, but it was no match for the interceptor. Foyce's raider slammed into the frigate at breakneck speed, right into the side, gleaming with fresh paint. They didn't explode at once. First, the two ships tumbled to the side, splattering a fan of debris around them, and only seconds later, they were enveloped in a cloud of yellow-white flame, which immediately died out in the icy void of space. Lehan fired several missiles, destroying the largest wreckage that might still have functioning equipment or surviving crew members, and ordered Achebe to return to Shadow Base. For weeks after the incident, they lived on pins and needles, awaiting the arrival of the Ullerian battle fleet. As time passed, however, it became clear that it had indeed been a random visit. The frigate had not reported its course, and a hyperspace anomaly had apparently prevented it from sending a distress signal before Foyce's suicidal attack. Life on the Shadow Base was back to normal, except that watches now had to be split into two, and the remaining raider had to be partially serviced so as not to be completely unarmed in the event of a sudden alarm. Days merged into weeks, weeks into months, and those into years. The hyperlink was silent, and the past life filled with various events, people, war, grief, violence, and rare moments of happiness seemed more and more like a mirage to Lehan. It was as if he had been born here, on the Shadow Base, and everything else was a hallucination of a brain tormented by sensory deprivation. He pulled on his uniform overalls and glanced at his watch. It was time to go relieve Achebe. His partner was bothering him more and more. Sure, he was a far cry from the seething, fierce reticence of Foyce or the aloofness of Kestel. But the fact that Achebe had completely abandoned his culinary studies and now he rarely went to the gym was alarming. Lehan had tried talking to him a couple of times, but found that both had practically forgotten how to talk about distracting topics. That, however, was fixable. Word after word, Lehan himself could use a little variety in his life. Achebe stood up as usual and greeted him with a silent nod. Lehan thought it was an excellent time to start his verbal exercises, but he didn't have time to say anything. The green light on the hyperspace receiver's panel lit up, and 3 lines of numbers appeared on the screen, which had been dark for years, the spatial coordinates of the next target. The words stuck in his throat. Lehan only let out a suppressed wheeze and pointed to the console. Achebe quickly turned around, just as both the indicator and the screen were fading. "What was it?" Achebe asked. Just like that, we're talking again, Lehan thought, and no complicated introductions or plotting are needed, just the simple act of finding the meaning of life again. "We have received our orders," he said. "We have a new mission." Achebe looked at him doubtfully. "But I didn't see any coordinates," he said. Something seemed to flicker on the screen, and the indicator blinked, but I didn't see any numbers. For security reasons, the logs of communication sessions were not recorded. The station duty officer had to memorize all input data. "I saw it clearly," Lehan said. The chains of numbers burned in his brain like the inscription at Balthazar's feast. What a silly comparison, he thought. On the other hand, maybe it wasn't so silly after all. He knew those coordinates. When it came to starting the hyperjump, they had a small argument. "The New Hope system?" Achebe asked as Lehan dictated the coordinates. "That's insane. They've been occupied since the war started. There should be a real fortress there by now." "We have our orders," Lehan said coldly. Achebe was silent for a moment. Lehan could clearly visualize his tense black face, jowls playing beneath the smooth skin. "All right," Achebe said. "This whole thing was taking too long anyway." And he put the raider into jump mode. They both didn't say a word during the hour and a half it took to jump into the New Hope system, and when the raider dropped into normal space, the time for lazy talks instantaneously became obsolete. All detection systems went off immediately, picking up multiple targets right on course. The raider flew in front of the entire fleet, which was moving in tight groups toward the inner part of the system, toward New Hope, the system's main inhabited planet, around which many orbital shipyards and repair stations had once been located. The vast, massive hulls of Ullerian battleships and cruisers were still silent, as were the scattering of smaller patrol and support vessels around them. Obviously, no one had expected a suicidal attack by a lone raider deep in the rear, and neither crews nor automatics immediately recognized the enemy ship that had suddenly fallen out of hyperjump. Fate gave Lehan and Achebe a good chance for the last time. They managed to fire both torpedoes at the massive battleship in the center of the formation and fire a missile salvo at the cruisers next to it when several energy beams streaked toward the raider from different directions, turning it into a cloud of glowing gas. Holy mother of crap! Clarence Jessic looked dazedly at Yoshida Sato, his partner. Spaghetti residue slowly slid off his already soiled pants, leaving greasy red marks, but he didn't notice it. What was that? I almost shit myself with surprise. Yoshida looked at Clarence's overalls and blinked twice. He was extremely annoyed by the navigator's unkempt appearance. However, this annoying detail could wait. Some ship jumped out of hyper just outside the center of the convoy and tried to attack it, Yoshida said. I haven't deciphered all the data yet, but it looks like it was a Manticore-class raider. Such an ancient piece of garbage? They were decommissioned about 10 years ago. I thought they'd all been cut up into needles already. Clarence scratched the back of his head in bewilderment. Could it be some kind of pirates? I've heard there are some dashing fellows who try to hijack a frigate or two out of decommissioned junk once in a while. Yoshida shook his head. They weren't trying to hijack anything. They started shooting right away. Shoot? Why would anyone shoot at an old Ullerian trough that's already on its way to the cemetery? By the way, there's no point in hijacking them either. They've been stripped of everything of any value for years. Only the hulls and temporary engines are left. Yoshida shrugged. I don't know. We can't ask them anything. The anti-comet automatics from the accompanying drones went off and vaporized them before they could introduce themselves. Clarence dropped his hands to his impressive thighs, slurped in the sauce, and grunted. When he stood up, the spaghetti scattered on the floor crunched under his soles. What a mess, he said, clearly referring to both the fallen food and the strange incident with the convoy of decommissioned ships. How are controls doing, and what's up with the ships those lunatics were shooting at? Yoshida tapped a few keys. No interruptions, he said, looking at the screen. All the cyber pilots are holding course. All is well. The defense drones shot down almost all the missiles fired by the raider. Only one battleship caught a torpedo in the belly. Thank God, its hot part has obviously long since fried. Looks like they used the early war-type warhead. I heard their cores usually degenerate within 5 or 6 years. They were out of use even before the end of the war. All right, Clarence said, looking regretfully at his trampled dinner. That's no concern of ours. We're only contracted to bring this scrap metal to final dismantling. We'll let the shipyard know about the incident and let them handle it. I think they had an old munitions recycling line there too. He looked at Yoshida. Will you do it? I need to change my clothes. And he stepped out of the deck house of an old Ullerian frigate, converted into a guide ship, controlling the many cyber pilots of the decommissioned fleet. It's about time, Yoshida thought. Just because you do a blue-collar job doesn't mean you can neglect your appearance. Any job deserves respect and should be done to the best of your ability, even the most thankless one. Damnation Garb. What can be scary about a clock? A simple electronic display on which the numbers alternate with monotonous regularity. The most familiar and ordinary device imaginable. But when you are trapped in the metal box of a space station, and the clock is counting down how long you have left to live, your attitude towards it becomes quite different. Taylor looked at the dial with hatred and despair. She couldn't tell exactly when she would run out of air, but it was definitely under 24 hours, probably sooner, and every second that changed on the dial was a nerve-wracking experience. "You have a way out." Taylor shuddered. It felt like a vacuum had grabbed her right by the heart, with an icy hand, choking her whole soul with the horror of the memories. She tried her best to keep them under the heavy lid, but how long could she do that? At what point would the fear of death overpower the fear of what was in the sarcophagus at the far end of the lab? She stood up and walked to the door. There was a small superplastic window in the massive sash of the airtight door, through which Taylor could see a curving corridor lit by a reddish emergency light. The station was shaped like a wheel, and the lab in which Taylor was trapped was one of many rooms in its rim. The view from the small embrasure was limited, but Taylor could clearly see the bullet marks in the corridor walls. To the right, one of the shots had apparently hit some kind of pipe drive, and a thin stream of white vapor was escaping through a hole in the light-colored wall lining. And to the left, Taylor forced herself not to look away. At least Canson was face down. Taylor looked as hard as she could, but in the semi-darkness of the vapor-filled hallway, she couldn't see if there were bullet entry wounds on Canson's body. There didn't seem to be any other injuries visible. Taylor remembered Kemet's twisted, broken body in the canteen and the dark, almost human-looking silhouette that had dodged her shots with incredible speed, running down the radial corridor. Tomiko was still out there somewhere, on the station, invulnerable to the poison gas that filled every room and passage, insensitive to high and low temperatures. Taylor looked at the gun she held in her hand. Judging by the fact that Tomiko was at least trying to dodge her shots, the firearm could still hurt her. But hitting her was no easy task. Taylor didn't know what happened to Vince Mahalski and Maria Suarez. When it all started, they were in an outrigger module on the far side of the station's rim, and there was no contact. Something unpleasant stirred deep in her brain. Didn't know, or didn't want to know. Questions jostled, bubbling, scratching with their uncomfortably prickly meanings. What had happened to Canson? Why were Mahalski and Suarez silent? The internal comms were online, but all channels were dead silent. Who had released the poison gas into the station's premises? Taylor found it harder to breathe. She looked again at the clock, counting down the merciless seconds. The emergency ventilation system could not be triggered remotely. The fumigation mixture was pumped into the station in the event of a red-level biological alert, and that could only be turned off from the central console, which was a 10-minute walk from the lab. Who would have thought that such a trifling distance could become insurmountable? Taylor was well-trained and had even freediving on vacations, but 10 minutes was at least double her personal record for breath-holding. "You have a way out." Taylor looked at the gun again. She'd sooner use it than resort to this way out. Against her will, she glanced back at the sarcophagus, gleaming with alien black metal. Christ, she's not a soldier, not some shock trooper from the Second Ullerian War. She's just an ordinary scientist, a specialist in the microbiology of young planets. And it was on such a planet whose evolution hadn't even gotten to oxygen exchange yet that they would find an abandoned alien base. Canson claimed they were left by Noidar, one of the races wiped out by the Ullerians. Maybe. Taylor didn't know much about the military history of that terrible civilization, whose onslaught the humans had managed to stop 30 years ago at great cost, in effort and sacrifice. Kansen had said that supposedly the Noidarians were almost equal technology-wise to the Ullerians and had managed to put up a fierce resistance. But they still lost. That was nearly 2,000 years ago. Ironically, it was Teyla who insisted on bringing both sarcophagi to the station to study the remains of the Noidar, something any Earth scientist could only dream of. The Ullerians had turned all Noidar worlds into molten balls of stone and erased virtually all memories of the race from their history. The Noidar had become legendary, the only race that had managed to organize a decent resistance to the conglomerate before the Ullerians met the humans. Decent, but not enough. Teyla wiped the sweat beading on her face. It was definitely getting harder to breathe. How much time did she have left before she began to lose consciousness? A few hours? Like an altar to Satan, the sarcophagus beckoned to her, promising life, power, and strength. If she surrendered, she would live. She could safely reach the central console and turn off the fumigation. She might even be able to deal with Tamiko. Exactly the price mentioned in Faust. A symbiotic Noidarian combat suit. A desperate last resort against the Ullerian Conglomerate. A pseudo-intelligent structure that had outlived its masters, who had died 2,000 years ago and had been waiting all these centuries for the opportunity to return to its direct duties. Combat duties. Unfortunately, during those centuries of solitude and inactivity, it turned from pseudo-intelligent to completely insane. The biohazard measures turned out to be futile. When the combat suits sensed the presence of new potential hosts, they immediately seized the opportunity. The pressurized box, plastic overalls, and gas masks could not stop them. They were designed for spaceship boarding and hand-to-hand combat with Ullerian stormtroopers. Teyla felt the darkness stirring in the back of her mind. Perhaps not all the sweat on her face was due to the lack of oxygen. But she had found the combination. She had managed to deactivate the combat suit that had captured her and sent it back into the sarcophagus. Now it lay there, a shapeless lump of grayish, nasal biomass. A completely innocuous-looking thing, like a primitive deep-sea sponge accidentally discarded in shallow water. Damnation Garb. A path to salvation, to the cursed salvation. No, she won't go for it. She wouldn't let this thing dig into her head and control her every move anymore. Teyla thought something had moved behind the thick plastic of the window in the hallway. She gripped her gun more comfortably and cautiously approached the door. Tamiko? The heavy door was locked tight from the inside. Teyla had burned out the control circuitry. But who knew what the damn suit was capable of? It was getting harder and harder to breathe, and her eyes were spinning in circles. The only thing visible through the window was thick puffs of vapor, illuminated by red lights. But there were definitely some human-like shadows moving in that disturbing fog. Had Mohalski and Suarez really gotten out and tackled Tamiko? No way. It was impossible because they're... Just in case, Teyla stepped back and took cover behind the overturned table, pointing her gun at the door. Even if Tamiko managed to open the door, Teyla would have time to empty a full clip at her before the poison gas filled her lungs. The thought that just a few steps behind her in the sarcophagus lay a way to survive stung her consciousness with a red-hot nail. But at this point, fatigue and lack of oxygen finally won out. At the very last moment before she lost consciousness, Teyla saw the door open and some figures rushed into the lab, but she didn't have time to fire a shot. How is she? The doctor turned around at the sound of the voice. Physically, she's pretty much okay, he said, pointing to the screen. Teyla was sleeping soundly on the sick bay bunk, and despite the IV and a few sensors hooked up to her, really did look quite healthy. Some signs of exhaustion are certainly there, but nothing too bad. Psychologically, quite a different story. The commander of the rescue team that had arrived at Faust Station a week ago looked thoughtfully at the screen. The young woman's calm face looked beautiful and peaceful, even despite a few abrasions and stitches on her cuts. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? "Are you keeping her under sedation?" the commander asked. "Yes, of course," said the doctor. "After the debacle she caused 3 days ago, we are trying to avoid unnecessary risks. However, I have a suspicion that now she will not wake up, even if we drastically reduce the dose of the drug." "Post-traumatic shock?" The doctor nodded. "Everything points to that. Unfortunately, a large scanner was damaged during the waking incident, and we can't do a full body scan, but from the looks of it, her problems are purely psychological." The commander sighed. "Well, we'll have to wait until we return to base. Her fate will depend on these results. So far, her choices are not too bright, either court and prison or a closed psychiatric clinic." The doctor shook his head, incredulously. "I can't believe this was all her doing." The commander squinted, looking at the screen, and yet that's precisely what it was. The results of the investigation are pretty unambiguous. Something happened to her there that caused her to go bananas completely. First, she attacked the station manager, Kemet, and turned him into a chop. I've never seen such a terribly beat-up body in my life. Then she shot Tomiko Okada, who was her friend, by the way. She tried to run away, mortally wounded. We found her hiding in the pantry, bled to death. Then she blew the jumper to the remote module where Mohalski and Suarez were working, and they died of depressurization. And then she turned on the fumigation and poisoned Kansen, who she never found. Eventually, she almost ran out of oxygen in the lab. We got there at the last minute. But even as she was losing consciousness, she tried to shoot us. The doctor looked at the screen again. "Yeah, it's hard to believe. No idea what the trigger might have been?" "That's more for me to ask you," said the commander. "How would I know? You're the medic." "There's nothing in her medical history to suggest that," the doctor said. There was a good amount of doubt in his voice. "That's why I asked you. There's clearly some outside influence, but what kind of influence? The Faust Station was investigating early evolution, and life was barely born on this planet. I heard they found some alien artifacts." The commander nodded. "Yes, there was once a Noidar base here. I've seen the artifacts. A pile of scrap metal, nothing more. However, I have to give the Noidarians credit. They used an alloy that lasted almost 2,000 years. Archaeologists will probably be happy, but it looks like a pile of rubble to me. Any organics have long since broken down into atoms." "We have a very good hospital on the base," the doctor said. "I think they'll get her out." "I hope so," the commander replied. "In any case, we've done our job. I suppose the investigators and forensic experts will take it from here." And he walked out, leaving the doctor staring at the screen. I wonder, the doctor thought, how on earth she got from the central console to the lab after she turned on the fumigation. Taylor swam through the waves of nightmarish visions, holding on to their surface like a seasoned sailor on the high seas after a shipwreck. Part of her mind told her that she had been saved, that she had been found and brought back to the ship, to sick bay. That part was the most gratifying, but also the weakest and most inconsequential. The other part was the memory, which was that black abyss of memories that she tried hard not to look into. Something told her that some of those memories didn't even belong to her. They reeked of antiquity and violence. And the third part. "Hello, Taylor," the combat suit said in her head. "You didn't think you'd get rid of me so easily, did you? You and I have a lot more to do."